Hello, everybody, our dear speakers, our dear followers of the Atlantic Dialogues, which is organized every year by the Policy Center for the New South. And the session today will take a look at some of the current overlapping geopolitical issues in Africa and the Arab world. This session honors me by moderating speakers from Arab and African nations. I will not bring in anything new to the table by simply saying that Africa and the Arab world have a lot of bonds together. I'm not going to say relations. These are bonds because they are strong, they are stable, and these bonds go even beyond the casual and variable interests. These bonds, these ties are geographically based, first of all, because the two Arab and African spaces are linear geographically, and the Arab world extends into North Africa through the brotherly nation of Egypt and the North African Arab countries. And the Arabian Peninsula has a geographic link over the Bab al-Mandab and the Red Sea through the Horn of Africa, and the Arab world has always entertained relations with the countries in Eastern Africa through the Indian Ocean. And there are also historical ties, religious, cultural, civilizational, and even commercial, that have left an imprint on language, on poetry, on art, on literature, and on a number of aspects of life. Obviously, there's been a time of a freeze that has happened during the colonial period, which created a sort of a schism between Africa and the Arab world. And that has lasted over 50 years or about 100 years, depending on the geographies we're talking about. And the colonizers have separated the Arab world and Africa in order to ensure that they rule comfortably. And these two geographic spaces have connected, or reconnected more accurately. And this happened in the post-colonial era with the non-aligned movement, which has played a large role in supporting countries achieving their independence in Africa and the Arab world. And here we are today, and after what we used to know as the Cold War, these two regions have causes and reasons to bring together their efforts as they look at different geopolitical aspects and factors, whether to consolidate mutual interests or to ensure that the threats around both regions are being countered. Now, I'm not going to linger in my introduction, and I will give the floor right away to our speakers. And I will start with Mr. Fatou Haikel, who is a political advisor at the Trends Research and Advisory, and he's the director of research in that institute, and he is well-versed in issues related to extremism, terrorism, and other geopolitical issues. Mr. Fatou, the floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Abdelhaq, for this introduction and for your kind invitation for me to participate in this panel discussion with an elite of speakers and consultants. And I'm proud to be with you at this panel. I would like to thank the organizers of this event, the Policy Center for the New South, of course, and for selecting this theme, which I dare say it's an old but also a new topic that is highly topical, given what we are perceiving in terms of precipitated changes around the world. And I will concentrate on two main themes. First, I will like to share with you my understanding of the overlapping relations between the Arab world and the African countries, and secondly, how we could be looking towards the future and how we can consolidate Arab-African ties going forward. As you have said in your introduction, Dr. Abdel Haq, there are cultural, historical, and political ties between Africa and the Arab world, and that has started centuries ago. And those ties have created a solid platform for boosting cooperation across history between the Arabs on one side and the Africans on the other side, ever since the expansion of Islam in Africa, and even before the expansion of Islam, since the very beginnings of Islam, there are connections between the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. These historic ties are static and are entrenched. These ties represent a lever, basically, to drive forward relations between the two sides. And before we come into the modern era, there have been ups and downs, and particularly during the colonial period, with the Arab nations playing a key role in supporting the independent movements in various African countries, and Nasserist Egypt more particularly, and its interest in Africa has played one of the more major roles in supporting liberation movements. And here I would like to quickly indicate a piece of information. Cairo used to host most of the independence movements in Africa at the time, and this up until today, something that African nations remember, and they pay tribute to Egypt and to the wider Arab world just for that, which is a testament to the strength of the existing bonds from the African perspective. But the issue now is whether these historic relations are as strong and as coordinated as we've seen over centuries, particularly during the decolonization period. And the answer very succinctly is no. There's been a great many changing factors in the scene, and those contributed to a regression of the level of coordination and solid relations, so much so that sometimes we've seen tensions between African and Arab countries. And some of these factors have to do with points of proximity between Africa and the Arab world, and this has yielded overlaps and sometimes even a mixing of bloodlines, and this has also supported the cultural bonds between the two sides, but also on the other end has created some political tensions and sensitivities, and even crises of a political nature. And the regional expansion of some ethnicities across African and Arab countries has created tensions between the two camps, as we've seen between Mauritania and Senegal more than on one occasion. There are also border issues between Arab nations and African countries, which have not been settled up until today, and this has had its own effect on creating and sometimes boosting those sensitivities and tensions. There's also the issue of rivers, and the water issue generally is becoming one point of contention and instability. And initially, it was supposed to be one of the areas of opportunity for boosting relations and benefiting from mutual assets. Then there's another factor, which is the regression of Arab interest in general when it came to African issues. African issues are no longer priorities for a number of Arab countries over the past decades to what they were for the Arab world in the 1950s. And this regression has been accompanied by what I may call a kind of African discomfort with the Arab nations trying to give precedence to Arab issues over African issues. And one of the African leaders that I might quote here, where he said that the African Union today, which was before the Union of African Nations, cannot discuss African issues because it's so busy just discussing Arab African issues, meaning Arab issues, particularly by Arab nations that exist on the African continent. And so this was another factor that led to that regression in coordination. And this regressing Arab interest in African issues happened at a time when we saw that the majority of regional and international powers increasing their presence on the African continent for a number of reasons, whether economic or strategic or development related. And so African nations started seeing that they have alternatives and significant alternatives to the Arab world, particularly that these countries are looking to get out of the circle of poverty and need. Another, and probably the last factor that we need to indicate here, has to do with the negative perception amid Arabs and amid Africans equally. So the received idea in the African mind is that the Arabs in general are slave traders, and they still remember the idea of the Arab merchant who would seize slaves and send them out to the United States and other parts of the world. And so this kind is something that is problematic. And similarly, on the Arab camp, there is a stereotype that says that Africa is still underdeveloped, that is awash with corruption and instability. And as such, let me just indicate in the presence of Amr Moussa that some Arab diplomats used to say that if they are going to be dispatched to Africa, we are being punished or sanctioned. And so this is how that Arab interest in African issues has gotten. And so obviously we all want for relations to come back strong. And up until today, the African majority is still supportive of Arab issues and Arab areas of interests, and there are still a number of mutual causes and mutual roots and factors that are used towards building stronger relations going forward. And so the question is, how are we to build that collective future? In order to ensure that the future will be stronger, we have to agree on the following. We have to look at the mutual interests, because interests at the end of the day prevail. And so building strong ties requires a strong base of mutual interests with African countries. This requires a greater interest in economic development in African countries, and also a boosting of economic and investment relations between Arab countries and Africa. And this kind of trend, we're seeing that it's gaining momentum. So we can agree that there's more and more interest today. We are seeing a beginning of more and more interest in investing and also working with economies on the part of Arab countries. There's about 1 billion inhabitants in Africa. It's that large of a market, and it's a market that would benefit not only Africans, but also their Arab friends. And so there's a clear need for boosting development and economic ties between the two sides. Then there's also greater interest in African issues on the part of the Arab countries. The Arabs obviously give precedence to their own issues and causes, but there's also a need for taking interest in African issues. And the African Arabs within the African Union or other African blocs like regional blocs, the presentation of Arab issues should be accompanied by African issues and show an interest for those, including development, economic relations, and extremism and terrorism. And this is something that Africans do not feel yet. Then we have to also expand our interest in confronting shared security threats, because there is a security entry point, and Africans are conducting coordination efforts, and some Arab countries are doing that, and it should benefit from Arab interest. So the security entry point and dealing with the security issues of Africa, particularly having to do with extremism and terrorism, and also dealing with the irregular migration, which has been observed to be on the increase. Then there is another important issue, which is to galvanize cultural activities between the two sides and implement the role of universities and associations, in addition to religious authorities. Let's agree that there are official religious authorities like Al-Azhar, Al-Qayrawan in Tunis, and Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, and other religious institutions that attract thousands of Muslim Africans. And these institutions could be, again, another opportunity for us to strengthen relations between Arabs and Africans. So the solid base is there. History, culture, civilization are there. But what is even more important is that we start applying some pragmatism in dealing with Africa that will do away with some of the downsides of our interactions in the past. Thank you. Dr. Abdel Haq, we can't hear you because your microphone is on mute. Thank you very much, says Dr. Abdel Haq Bassou. Thank you for this instructive presentation in which you reviewed the overlaps between Africa and the Arab world, and you shared with us also your outlook and opportunities for building a stronger future. Now we'll give the floor right away to Mr. Hamza Al-Muaddib. He is a non-resident scholar at the Malcolm Care Carnegie Middle East Center. The floor is yours. Thank you, Dr. Abdel Haq. Thank you for the invitation. My presentation will focus mainly on the relationship between North Africa and basically the countries of the Maghreb region and the Sahel countries, because it is clear that since 2011, that historic moment that we all know with the protests and the uprisings in the Arab world and the fundamental changes that took place at the time. And we have seen that those uprisings have brought fundamental changes, including the collapse of certain regimes, as was the case in Tunisia and Libya. And then there were changes in the Sahel region, and how that had repercussions on the North African countries in turn. And I think that there's a strong bond between North African Arab countries and the Sahel countries, whether we're talking about the security dimension, and also we've seen some of the challenges and security threats that have resulted from the collapse of certain regimes, with repercussions felt all the way in Mali and in other Sahel countries. On the other end, well, there are issues faced in Sahel countries, whether these have to do with the incapability of some nations to ensure security in a large swath of land, in addition to economic difficulties and also environmental and just weather difficulties that have resulted in flows of migration and security issues. And migration flows, as I've just mentioned, have become a point of interest not just for Europeans, but also for the Maghreb Arab countries, more particularly Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And this has created a new reality. And obviously, migration should not be looked at solely as a threat or as a risk, but no, it has actually been quite a great opportunity for some countries in North Africa, as is the case in Tunisia and Morocco. And in Morocco, indeed, we have seen that there are positive exchanges of students, of labor, etc., which goes to show that these economies are also showing some increased interest in working together. And that work is being felt by the North African Arab countries and the Saharan Sahel countries. And I guess I could summarize my presentation in three main points that I think are now structuring relations between the Maghreb Arab countries and the Sahel region. First aspect has to do with the collapse of some countries, as was the case of Libya and Mali, or the incapability of certain countries in controlling the security over large swaths of land. And this is the case in the Sahel countries. And we've seen that there have been certain repercussions to the Colonel Gaddafi's regime collapse in Libya, which has created a sort of vacuum, strategic vacuum. So there's been also infighting in Libya that has resulted in the inability of Libyan actors to reach consensus or settlement towards rebuilding the nation and ensuring security. And that has led to something that resembles a Libya that is a platform for terrorist groups or rebel groups. And we've seen that in Chad, for instance, with some of the forces, the opposition forces in Chad, taking the opportunity of that vacuum there. And then we have seen what happened in North Mali and the implications of the collapse of Muammar al-Gaddafi's regime in that country. Now, at the same time, it seems to me that the weakness of some countries in the Sahel, and we're talking about a large geographic area, but historically, the state has not been really strong, whether we're talking about Mali, Chad, Niger, and even Burkina Faso. And by the way, Burkina Faso has become maybe a small theater, but a theater for the expansion of some terrorist groups. And this is a reflection of the inability of some Sahel countries to control their own territories and the difficulties that emanate from that security challenge. And maybe a second important factor that will help us understand the current situation has to do with the close link between what was going on in North Africa and the Maghreb Arab countries and the Sahel region, and that is the foreign intervention. With the collapse of the Muammar Gaddafi's regime and the inability of Libyan players to come to a consensus and find a way to rebuild the nation quickly and close the gaps, well, that opened it up for foreign intervention. And for decades, most probably, there's been a whole discussion about how the Maghreb Arab countries have been basically preserved from proxy wars that we've seen in the past in Lebanon and Iraq. And the Maghreb Arab region has been pretty insulated from that. But with the collapse of the Libyan regime, we have seen with our own eyes how Libya has become a theater for foreign intervention. The situation collapsed further, and the security situation became untenable. And this has had its own implications and repercussions in other places, including in the neighborhood, of course, given their increased inability in controlling the security factors. And I think that the Russian intervention was probably the most prominent in as far as really showcasing the security vacuum and the repercussions of that collapse in Libya. This has created an opportunity for a country like Russia to be in Libya and to start making ready for a certain Russian presence in Mali. And this goes to show the increased competition of sway in the Sahel region by superpowers. And I think that the overlapping relations and overlapping theaters between North and Sahel is of interest here. A third factor that I think we should pay attention to. Well, in light of these risks, there's no coordination between countries of the Maghreb Arab countries and the Sahel countries when it came to dealing with security issues. Tunisia is looking inward, given its current situation with the process of democratization and the socioeconomic difficulties. Libya obviously is an already divided country. Mauritania is playing a role in fighting terrorism, but there isn't any kind of coordination. And then there is the differences between Morocco and Algeria that are resulting in a lack of coordination among the countries of the Maghreb Arab region, among themselves and with the Sahel countries, and coordination with the EU and the European countries that are stakeholders in some of these issues, whether it has to do with migration or other. We have seen that there's an absence of European players. There are only bilateral relations, not really a collective coordination. And I think this is a real issue, whether we're talking about risks of terrorism or organized crime or migration issues or inflows of persons. These are cross-border issues, and you deal with these issues right now without any kind of coordinated mechanisms. Although the issues are a point of interest for all those stakeholders, but there's no mechanism that brings together all of those efforts together across regions. And this has led to a certain difficulty in dealing with those issues. And, you know, the instability in Libya, as we've seen, could be an entry point to destabilize other parts of the region. And we've seen that the division and war and the Barkhane operation in Mali has led to certain situations that did not pertain only to Mali, but they went overboard. And we've seen difficulties in dealing with terrorist and armed groups with the repercussions in other territories in the neighborhood. And we've seen that in Burkina Faso and Niger. And it seems like it has become difficult given the expanse of the geographical space and also the severity of these challenges, because they are not just security issues, they're linked also to demographics, to the environment, to socioeconomic difficulties. And indeed, there is a clear challenge in not having a coordination mechanism across the region or with our neighbors in the north, that is in Europe. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamza, for this presentation, which focused on the three main issues: the relation between the Sahel countries and the Arab Maghreb countries, together the relatedness of this collapse to foreign overseas interventions, together with the lack of coordination among Maghreb countries in order to face those issues and predicaments coming from sub-Saharan Africa and the Sahel countries. For now is to our friend, Professor Mahmoud Dahan. Ahmed Mahmoud Dahan comes from Mauritania. He's a scholar and is a political figure with various diplomatic political title positions in his country, but also in different parts of the Arab world. He's also an eminent figure who took part to the management of various research institutions. Mr. Mahmoud Dahan, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdel Haq. Let me extend heartfelt thanks to you all for this precious opportunity you've given us listening to those eminent experts and to you for exchanging views, standpoints, and ideas. This is actually a seminal topic of which we're proud, and heartfelt thanks are reiterated to you all. Let me draw your attention to various reminders, because all these issues you're most knowledgeable about. But let me remind you of the fact that 2/3 of the Arabs are Africans, and 1/5 of Africans are Arabs. Secondly, and that's something you already pointed out too in your introduction, the Sahara has never been a barrier that would hamper communication, but throughout centuries it has been a bridge of constant and fruitful exchanges in various human, economic, cultural aspects. Thirdly, and that's something that I would like to point out to before moving to the bone of contention of my presentation, i.e. the fact that building Africa started the aftermath of independence in the city of Casablanca and another African city. Fourthly, and that's something pointed out to by Dr. Fatou, African and Arab leaders such as Nkrumah, Abdel Nasser, Mandela, were fully conscious of the importance of the Arab-African ties that they have spared no effort to further strengthen. After these brief reminders, let me tackle the issue from another perspective, from another entry point, in as much as there are in-depth significant changes throughout the world, and that the world systems are also speedily changing. It is therefore very important that we be aware of those changes so that we get to know what we want to do with our Arab world, with our African brothers and neighbors. Let me point out to various pieces of evidence as to these ongoing changes. Western powers, and to me point out to the US and Europe that used to have the upper hand and the monopoly of technology, industry, knowledge, economics, and the military, have started feeling that there are other nations that may catch up in terms of this scientific technological progress it used to achieve in the past and over which it used to have the monopoly, and that the American leader is no longer reassured in as much as its traditional ally, namely Europe, is no longer capable of facing ascending rivals and competitors, namely China and others. So regarding this change in the international systems and after the collapse of the various groups, so the Atlantic Alliance and has started losing its power and hegemony in as much as some of its opponents have started describing its status as that of being a state or a status of an agonizing entity. So therefore, the traditional poles are changing, and the northern hemisphere is still hegemonic, and we know that whoever has the hammer looks at every other issue as being a nail. Therefore, the existing alliances and superpowers, be they Western or non-Western, so they are competing for Africa. So, and as an African alliance, we need to benefit from this competition and try to optimize it, which requires that we do some adjustments and arrangements in as much as there isn't any type of coordination amongst Arab Maghreb countries and even in the Arab world. That's something that has been pointed out to by my predecessor, Mr. Hamza Medeb. So it is a must for Arabs to first and foremost reconstruct, rebuild their own nations on rational, pragmatic pillars, far from any type of emotions, in order for them to be in the capacity of highlighting a project that would be accepted by new generations and a project that would also be able to face the existing thesis of globalization, including climate change, including gas emissions, including various other predicaments. So we are now faced with various theses as to the origin of the coronavirus, each party indicting the other party. So we no longer have kind of pillar that we could use in order to get to know the truth. But we are in a situation where we need to build alliances amongst ourselves, put in place various arrangements and adjustments, gain the trust and confidence of our generations, and face the current challenges that the Arab world and the African world is faced with. And we need to actually face all those attempts to indict the other as being Satan, such as what is being done between the Russians versus the French, and with various forms of indictment being always directed and geared towards the other. Therefore, from a security point of view and from an economic point of view, we need to actually work together to guarantee prosperity and the welfare of our nations, and in order to have good competitors within the African continent, because Maghrebian companies and Arab companies could actually work on huge industrial and infrastructure projects with competitive prices and rates. But actually, those opportunities are always left out to the others. So the overseas parties. So therefore, we need to face these dilemmas and get out of this tumultuous situation so that we actually become solidarity oriented with the various arrangements and adjustments we need to do inside our nations in order for us to access international markets and to conduct beneficial transactions for us together with our African brothers, and in order for us to protect ourselves from the necessity of getting into those polarizing forces of systems that are in the pipe. So, because as Eisenhower used to say, between evil and good, you definitely need to make your choice as to which party you need to sideline with. Maybe I'll stop at this level in terms of my introductory statement, and I am available for any further queries and questions that you're ready to address. Mr. Abdelhaq, could you please open your microphone? Thank you, Mr. Dahan Ahmed Mahmoud, for this presentation, together with your recommendation regarding introducing arrangements and adjustments at the level of the Arab countries in order to further optimize new competitiveness taking place in today's world. Floor now is to His Excellency Mr. Amr Moussa, former Secretary General of the Arab League. An eminent figure who occupied various diplomatic and ministerial title positions within sisterly nation of Egypt. Together with the various missions he was entrusted with, not only in the Arab world, but internationally. Professor Amr Moussa, floor is yours, sir. Thank you. Mr. Abdel Haq, my thanks are further extended to the Center of Research and LCP Policy Center for inviting me to take part to this important webinar. I would like to commend the initiative of choosing this seminal topic, i.e. the relations between the Arab and the African worlds, and cogently described by you, Mr. Abdel Haq, in as much as we need to upgrade the word relation to move to ties and bonds, because ties and bonds are stronger than relations. Ties and bonds and communication amongst Arab nations and Africa are secular ones, but in the contemporary world and in the UN system, the Arab world, and most particularly Jamal Abdel Nasser and Egypt used to give strong impotence to the right to decide of one's destiny and get rid of the colonial powers as of the mid-50s of the former century. Hence this overlap, as underlined by Dr. Fattouh, this overlap in terms of interests and roles of Africa and in the Arab world, in the contemporary world, versus Africa's endorsement and upholding of various Arab issues and prioritizing the latter. And I do believe what Mobutu Sese Seko had said once in the General Assembly when he complained from pressures exerted on his country and him attempting to make him not uphold the Arab countries, especially against Israeli occupation. So he said, I've been given the choice to choose between my brother and my friend. And I have made the choice of advocating for and upholding and supporting my brother. So with relation, of course, to Western interests and where in some African countries, so he had decided to actually create a kind of a collapse of cohesion amongst Arab countries, an endeavor that was doomed to failure. So by upholding the independence of African countries and their right to decide of their own destinies, together with the efficient and effective Arab role to create the organization of the Arab unity and agree about its charter, all along with the various issues that the Arab countries need to advocate for and stand for. And as Mr. Dahan has aptly pointed out too, so Arab peoples are African, and the Arab world, be it part of Africa or not, from the Red Sea borders on as well as the Indian Ocean. There are strong ties, trade, cultural, historical, commercial relations with Asian Arab countries. So there is a huge historical, secular overlap among societies and the peoples of Africa, as well as the peoples of the Arab world. Many of our brothers amongst the panelists and speakers in this webinar, so they spoke about various issues and groups and those that have constituted the kind of referential that could actually be entrusted by Asian countries, African countries, Latin American countries on the basis of this non-aligned movement, allies, and the Cold War between the US and Russia. But it was not wise that we do join this side or the other. In this contemporary history, in the cooperation and solidarity between the Arab world and Africa as a timely topic we are discussing here, and when I used to be Secretary General of the Arab League in 2010, in Libya, in Sirte, I had suggested the creation of the League of the Arab Neighborhood, which was supposed to give a strong impetus to the Arab League and change its structure by allowing for 15 African countries states to join. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No, we can't hear Mr. Amr Musa clearly, unfortunately.
انقطع الاتصال أظن. انقطع الاتصال كان.
Connection signal is unstable. Now it's better, Mr. Musa.
أنا حاولت أن
sound issues. So this I had tried to invest in 2010, right before the chaos that prevailed in various parts of the Arab world, suggesting creating this league or alliance of Arab neighborhood countries, so including countries from the south of Arab Maghrebian countries, including the Horn of Africa, together with other African states in order to create this coalition while seeking to serve economic, political, and cultural interests. But various Arab leaders objected to this initiative and affirmed that they could not accept this proposal, namely late President Mubarak, who opposed this initiative. So I would like actually call for the institutionalization of an entity that would gather African and Arab states together with other states that would fulfill certain criteria of eligibility. Similarly, and during the first decade of this century, we have tried to also create another institutional entity that would serve the major causes of the African Union and those of the Arab League. And there were always decisions made by both entities in order to call countries from both entities in order to join meetings. The call from Darfur in Sudan on the basis of understanding between the Arab League and the African Union. So with the sending of peace forces, so including countries such as Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan, and other countries, which created a kind of quantum leap in terms of Arab cooperation out there in the field to face existing predicaments and issues that requested actions and undertakings taken commonly by Arab countries and African ones throughout the implementation of those endeavors. I would like to address here the issue of concepts. So when we used to speak about a non-nuclear Africa, we at the same time spoke about an area which is nuclear weapons free. And at the African level, so this African weapons or nuclear weapons free could not be conceived unless we have a similar situation in the Middle East, i.e. and nuclear weapons Middle East free. So we had to work together in establishing an area which is free of nuclear weapons in order to complete in the Middle East, in order to complete the similar project in Africa, one where there would be no massive destruction weapons all along with a Middle East area. And for us to reach out the fit of implementation of those interests out there in the field, we had made significant progress in the first decade of the 21st century on those collective endeavors between the African Union, the Arab League, between Africa and the Arab world generally. Sound lost? So step by step, we are moving towards a new world system, one that would emerge and that cannot do without the United Nations. However, it shall renew the UN, rejuvenate it, and give it impetus. And that's something I have kept repeating in various international fora, because the UN is a success story that is illustrated in the various UN agencies, intellectual property, women, gender, children, but failure actually lies at the level of the Security Council and the General Assembly. The acute questions that are at stake in how to surmount this failure at the level of the Security Council versus the successes made by the various UN agencies and the ad hoc apparatuses. So same challenges faced by the African Union and the EU, which definitely need to change. However, they will always be there. They will be saved. And the African Union, for me, is the most important and most successful regional organization. However, we need to inject new blood in it with new gender perspectives, as well as a fresh eye on the upcoming challenges that did not exist in the former century. So there are two issues, the pandemics together with climate change. So those issues will be prioritized to the extent that UN General Secretary has spoken about the necessity of including pandemic threats and the threats that are related to climate change because they will compromise and threaten the world peace and security, and that if we want to reshuffle the Security Council, we need to revisit the old explanations that only terrorism and militias and regional conflicts and small-scale and large-scale wars are the only drivers that could otherwise threaten world peace and security. Therefore, prevalence of pandemics and the adverse effects of climate changes need to be included as top priority items on the agendas and as endangering world peace and security. Therefore, they need to be prioritized and in the heart of those endeavors meant to amend and reshuffle international organizations such as the UN, Security Council, but also the African Union, the EU, all along with other international organizations in order for us to change gears and adopt new agendas. There is another issue, because I spoke about these two items, and two issues: the necessity of reconsidering the world system together with the Cold War, which would not necessarily have the same dimensions of the former Cold War taking place in the previous century. But whenever you have a military alliance, when you have Australia, the UK, so with the nuclear stakes and military alliances. So for me, this is a preamble to another Cold War, no one. So against the background of the fierce competitiveness between China and the US, the situation is quite tense. So when all this is brought to the African continent, of which we are part as Northern African countries all along with our brothers in Asia and that are all related to Africa. So this war will be exported to Africa. How? China has its huge project, the Belt and the Road, together with those coalitions emerging from the Western Europe to resist China on African territory.
And here, I'd like to thank my co-panelists and Dr. Abdelhaq. My co-panelists have mentioned the importance of reassessing the Arab-African relationship, economically speaking, because the Arabs have a tremendous amount of investment money that could be geared towards Africa to co-benefit Africans and Arabs. Then there's our North African brothers who have economic relations that are strong and historic with African countries, in addition to cultural ties with the African countries. And that includes Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, Mauritania, Djibouti, Sudan, Somalia, and others. There are a great many ties and real interests because Egypt right now is building dams over rivers in Tanzania. And this goes to show the amount of influence of Arab African nations in different parts of the African continent. And then there's the big issue of the Sahel. This is a key point of contention because the Sahel is open to two fronts, the Libyan front and the militias there that go towards the south, passing by Boko Haram and other terrorist groups in Mali. And all of those groups are taken a very serious turn because they combine terrorism with organized crime and migration, which has opened the region up for the very serious foreign intervention epitomized by France and then the Russian intervention in Libya. We've seen that earlier, and we've seen some areas of intervention in other parts of the Arab world. And foreign intervention is taking a different form in the 21st century, and different parties are playing different roles. Like there's the China-US bond, there's the China-EU bond, there's the French-Russia axis, and I think that the organizers are to be thanked for really showcasing the importance of these overlaps in geopolitical issues between the Arabs and the Africans, because we're not dealing just with the superpowers with whom we might not be able to stand up to fully, which are the US and Egypt, but there are other powers, regional powers, including Turkey and others. And this begs the question, how can we participate? How can we invest? How can we build co-benefiting projects? And as the brothers said, we have to maintain the mutual interests between the Arabs and the Africans. There is a lot of money and a lot of assets in the Arab world, but there's also expertise, and there's policymakers and technicians and technocrats who could benefit Africa. And so if we are going to issue any kind of statement out of this panel, well, it will have to insist on a sustainable bond between Arabs and Africans. And if there are Arab organizations that pay attention to this aspect, well, their banner should be building a shared policy for building a sustainable, solid bond between Arabs and Africans. Thank you. Thank you, Secretary General. Thank you very much for this highly instructive presentation, and you helped us remember some of the main historic milestones that have built the relations between Africa and the Arab world. And thank you for touching on the role of the US and China, and also for recommending towards the end of your presentation the importance of building a mutual and sustainable benefit-based bond between the Arab world and the African continent. The Secretary General Amr Moussa is saying that he cannot receive the sound. The other panelists, as well as the interpreters, are indicating that they can hear the moderator very well. So the issue might be on Mr. Amr Moussa's side. Do you hear me now, Mr. Amr Moussa? I couldn't hear you from the very moment I've ended my presentation. Is there any organizational matter that I should be aware of? No, says the moderator, not at all. The panelists, all of them, can hear me. And now Mr. Hamza is confirming, as well as Mr. Dahan. So it seems, the moderator says, the issue is on your side. Now, Mr. Moussa says that I can hear you very well. All right. Now let's move to the questions. Some of our followers have asked a few questions, and the first one, there's 3 or 4. First one says, how and on what basis we can build what you have called the Arab household or the Arab home? I'm reading the questions as they appear to me. Second question, how can we benefit from the changes happening in the international order and also benefit from foreign intervention? Question number 3, which is addressed to Mr. Hamza Mu'attib, because your name has been mentioned in the question. And the question is as follows: is cross-Arab coordination enough to deal and handle with some of the main issues faced by Arab countries? And the fourth and last question is, how can we build a common Arab future based on interest, or the concept of interest as was indicated in one of the presentations. Now, these are the 4 questions. I've just cited them as they were formulated, and we will now start backwards. So Mr. Amr Musa spoke last. He will speak first now in response to the questions that have been asked, and it's up to you, sir, to decide upon which question or questions you would like to respond to. Mr. Abdel Haq, it seems to me that the question having to do with on what basis can we claim to be able to build a Moroccan or an Arab household or an Arab home. And then there's a question about how can we build a collective Arab future based on the idea of interest. So I'm going to respond to these 2 questions. It's question number 1 and question number 4. Well, for me, the idea of the Arab world or the Arab household or the Arab home or the Arab fatherland, it has been heavily inflated since 2011. But let me recall and remind everybody that whatever is said about the Arab world and that there is no such thing as the pan-Arab nation or the Arab household, etc. And even when we see that there are some fundamental differences in terms of policy from one Arab bloc to another, but let me remind everybody as to what happened in Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia. The Tunisian people came out on the street in December. The interpreter indicates that the audio from Mr. Amr is cutting up heavily. Then we have seen not only demonstrations in Tunisia, but we've seen demonstrations in Lebanon, in Morocco, and other places. And this means that we have an Arab world, we have an Arab nationhood, we have an Arab personhood, and anybody that says anything against that is shown to be erroneous. And there's been mismanagement, there's been poor governance, there have been aspects of trying to circumvent regulations and laws. There were sometimes missed opportunities in terms of building certain cultural aspects. But what other things would prevent you from working as a pan-Arab nation? You have history, you have art, you have philosophy, you have literature, you have everything that you need in addition to the language. And so it was all a problem of poor governance. That's the only impediment. And obviously, we can fix it. And up until today, Mr. Abdel Haq, none of us, thinkers, intellectuals, scholars, to take stock of the reasons for this Arab household, this Arab home, coming together nicely. Because I have one side of the story, Mr. Abdel Haq has another side of the story, Mr. Fattouh as well, Mr. Hamza, Mr. Dahan. And so in response to the question, can we build a common Arab future? Of course we can, but we have to be able to fix our governance structure and to have the right people with now people stating that this is what binds us together and these are our opportunities in building a collective future. I mean, I don't want to linger, so I'd like to give the floor back to the moderator so that my co-panelists will have a chance to respond too. Well, sir, we have only 6 minutes remaining before we close. So thank you, Mr. Amr. We'd like to give the floor to the other co-panelists. Mr. Dahan Mahmoud, do you have any response? Mr. Ahmed Mahmoud, do you hear us? Asks the moderator.
أنا أسمعك.
هل لكم من تعليق على هذه الأسئلة التي ذكرناها؟
تعليق بسيط. هو أنا أريد أن أقول أن موضوع التغير الحاصل في النظام الدولي جعل الأقطاب الجديدة القديمة والجديدة تتنافس في أرضنا، ودمرت الكثير من بلداننا حتى تنجز أنشطتها، وعليه ربما شيء من هذا سببه عدم قدرتنا على تسيير بلداننا بالحكمة اللائقة، لكن كثير منه كان بسبب التدخل الأجنبي، وينبغي أن نعي هذا. بناء البيت العربي ينبغي ممكن ولا ينبغي أن نقول انتظر حتى تكون كل البلدان العربية تحت حكام رشيدة وكذا 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 حتى نبني البيت العربي. التحديات الموجودة على المستوى البيئي وعلى المستوى المناخي وعلى المستوى الأمني وعلى المستوى الأوبئة، كيف كان من الممكن ببساطة لو كانت في البيت العربي جهاز لهذا، كان من الممكن ببساطة أن يكون على الأقل التلقيح لكل العرب أمر سهل. هذا موضوع ليس بالبيت العربي. ينبغي أن نقول هذا البيت الذي كان لدينا خربان، وينبغي أن نبني بيت جديد على أسس جديدة يراها الناس ويراها الشباب، وحتى يطمحوا إلى بناء هذا البيت. تبقى أفكار عندي وعند الأجيال التي من جيلي وأسن، هذا شيء أكل عليه الدهر وشرب. لا بد أن يبنى بيت جديد يتماشى مع المشاكل المطروحة الجديدة. لماذا لا يمكن أن تكون المجموعة العربية لديها تنسيق عندما تذهب إلى قمة المناخ، ونحن جميعا لدينا نفس الأطروحات في هذا الموضوع؟ إذن أشياء بسيطة يمكن أن تضعها لبنة بعد لبنة ويبنى بيت جديد إن شاء الله. هذا هو الموضوع الذي، لكن لا بد من الوعي الشديد بأن العالم يتغير، وأن الغير لن يسمح لنا ولا يريدنا أن نبني وحدتنا. على سبيل المثال أنا
We have to be discussing an ever-changing world, and I have mentioned that the Moroccan or the Mauritanian and other nations have been able to get contracts in Mali to build roads, but some people don't want that because European companies would like to take the advantage and be able to earn those awards and those contracts in our backyard. And so we have to co-build, we have to coordinate in such a way as to ensure that our mutual interests are advanced and are furthered and are built upon. And so this is my 2 cents about the changing international order and how it could present an opportunity for better building forward. Thank you. The interpreter apologizes. It seems that technically the microphone has been turned off unwillingly. There was a question about the importance of coordination. There's indeed a need for coordinating with the countries from the African Union, and indeed the African Union is an important organization, and so is the EU, whether we're talking about France or other important EU countries who have a presence in Africa, or more particularly in the African Sahel. Let me focus on one point, which is that coordination need not be only about security. Wherever you go in the North African countries or the Sahel countries, any kind of coordination and co-building will have to be based on development in order to confront the social, economic, and environmental challenges. And let me just recall that the latest French initiative has included the World Bank, the United Nations, the UNDP, the French Development Agency, and this is a reconfirmation of the importance of development. And so there are different levels of coordination, and Arab countries need to be active and need to participate, whether in partnerships with the European countries or international organizations, including the World Bank, the United Nations, and other development agencies, or at the level of the African Union. Thank you, Brother Hamza. Dr. Fatou, the floor is yours. And as we await your response, there's been an added question, which is how does the Sino-American conflict influence the relations between Africans and Arabs? Thank you, Dr. Abdelhaq. Just quickly, about the question regarding the Arab building based on interest. Well, we're not going to reinvent the wheel. Europe, out of the Second World War, was destroyed, and it was co-built based on overlapping economic interests by creating co-benefits for populations and countries. And so it is this co-benefiting and co-interest making is what drives the wheel forward. And secondly, we should start with the consensus points and stay away from the contentious points. So we have to build the Arab household based on what we agree upon, and there are a great many causes that we agree upon across the Arab world. Now, with regard to the Chinese-American conflict's impact on Arab-African relations, as Mr. Amr Moussa and other co-panelists said, well, these changes to the international order have impacted conditions and situations across the world, and Arab-African relations are also subjected to this environment. So it's not just about the Arabs and Africans, it's about the Arabs themselves. Just within the Arab world, there's this competition between China and the US, which is asking deep questions in the Arab world about whether to go west or east. Then there's a reference to the non-aligned movement. Back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, there was a Cold War. And as Mr. Amr Moussa said, we have to remain non-aligned. We have to build our future and our relations without aligning with one camp over another, and just look at the mutual and shared interests. And I would like to close by saying that today there is a stock taken in the Arab world as to the importance of moving deeper into Africa and building relations. And there is a tendency now in Egypt in post-Mubarak era. And so the Egyptian state today is taking more interest in Africa and is gearing towards boosting relations with Africa, particularly that now there's a threat to national security if those relations are not built upon. Then there's interest in the Arabian Peninsula towards consolidating relations with Africa, particularly with what we've seen in terms of the scourge of piracy in the Horn of Africa and in Somalia, and the expansion of armed groups and terrorist groups in that area. So there's a greater interest now in Africa. And let me tell you that in terms of trade between the Arabian Gulf and Africa is about $71 billion in 2019, which is about 70% of Africa's trade with the entire Middle East. And so there's a clear interest in agriculture and support services and logistics. And in Saudi Arabia, we've heard an appointment of a minister in charge of relations with Africa, and it's Minister Mohammed Qattani, who was Saudi representative in the Arab League. And then there is a new initiative for development in Africa. And I think that the general picture that we're looking at moves us to a new situation that reminds us of where those relations were during the 50s and 60s, which were more solid relations than they are now. Thank you, Mr. Heikel. Thank you, our dear panelists. Thank you, all dear participants and followers, for being with us. I'd like to thank everybody, and I think Nisreen will send you the link to this panel on YouTube, and we have had a number of followers and viewers who have kept abreast of the various sessions that we organize as part of the Atlantic Dialogues. I'd like to thank Mr. Amr Musa, Mr. Ahmed Mahmoud Dahan, Mr. Fatouh Heikel, and Mr. Hamza Al-Muaddab. Thank you all very much and hope to see you very soon. Thank you all very much.